This is Hornby's Class 87. As you can see, it's a beautiful smooth runner straight from the box. This specifically is 87019 in the livery of Virgin Trains. Sir Winston Churchill is the name of the locomotive. You even get the etched nameplates in the packet. And you can see there it's a DCC ready model. DC, this one, we haven't fitted it with a decoder, so we are running it purely on DC. And one of the things that you will note occasionally on prototype AC electrics is a bit of a flash coming from the pantograph, where it breaks contact momentarily between the overhead wire and the running surface there of the pantograph. And it's something that you can create on your models, and I'm going to show you how you can do this today with a little tiny chip which is retailed in the UK through DMG Electech. This is the BS101 flashing light module. I'm going to install it inside this model, and this is an option. If you're not a DCC modeler, you can install this and still get those flashing catenary effects. So I'm going to show you how it's done. Let's get started. So, removing the packaging of the BS101 flashing light module, we get this little chip here. Now, its overall dimensions, using the good old-fashioned steel rule here, we've got 22mm in length, 13 in width, and we've got an overall height, including the components on both sides, of around about between 3 and 4mm. I'd call it 4mm just to stay on the safe side there. Now, that gives you an idea of the size of model that you're going to be able to fit this inside. I'd say at a push N gauge, very sort of, that would be on the limits of N gauge really. Very comfortable in 00 gauge and upwards. Now, what does this little module enable you to do? Well, simply put, it takes a DC or DCC power input, and it gives you 5 options in terms of outputs. It can give you a pantograph flashing light mode, a warning light mode, a ditch light with an interval time of 1 second, or a ditch light with an interval time of 2 seconds. The other option, of course, is that it's off. So on this little chip, we need to solder 2 wires, one to V1, the other to V2. There's no polarity that needs to be observed with these wires, because if you're running it on DC, you're going to change the polarity of them anyway as soon as you hit the reverse button on your controller. The other 3 terminals that we need to pay attention to are L1, L2 and L+. Now, I've read the instructions. L1 needs to be soldered to L2 for the flashing pantograph mode. So all I've done is cut a little piece of wire and soldered it into a U shape, and you can see I've just fed it through there and soldered it. And then the other one is L+. This leads to the little terminal on the positive side of the LED, and the negative side feeds to L1 or L2. Regardless, they're both soldered together, as I explained previously. Included with the kit, inside this little container here, are 2 surface mount diodes. That there is a surface mount diode. You can see it is very, very small. It measures in length just over 1 millimeter, and in width I'd say no more than 1 millimeter. And on it are 2 terminals. And this wire has to be soldered to each of those terminals there. So the red to the positive, the self colour to the negative. Now, I did feedback to DMG Electech that for the average modeler, their eyesight isn't going to be this good, and also soldering skills need to be at a very high level for this. So all the kits that you will be able to get hold of the BS101 flashing light module will be supplied with a pre-wired surface mount diode, so you won't get this in your kit. There you go, you've me to thank for that. So to install the chip inside the body shell of the Hornby Class 87, you'll need to unclip it, and that's done quite easily using just simply your nails. There are 6 clips which hold it in place, 2 centrally and 2 underneath the cab doors at each end. Once that's removed, you gain access to the PCB on top. You can see we've got a little decoder blanking plug in there in place actually at the moment. There are a few things to be aware of with this model. The LED lighting is carried through to the cabs via these little springs here. Now we don't want to interfere with the way these springs touch on these little pads here of the PCB. So basically wherever we place this little chip must be within the confines of this space here of the above the PCB. You'll note that it is protected by a coating here, so all of the little components there shouldn't short out on this, but just to play safe, what we're going to do is put a little piece of electrical tape on there, and that'll enable us to have a bit of a pad there to place this little chip above there, and of course inside there we've got plenty of room to locate it. How do I know? Well, I've done a test fit already. So I want to fit this tiny little LED, you can see there on my hand, at the very tip of those wires, onto the top of that pantograph there with a little bit of super glue. So let's remove the pantograph. It's just a clip-in item. That should pop off easily. There we go. And all I'm going to do is use a pin vise here, which is fitted with a 1.5mm diameter drill bit. We're just going to go in straight through the top there, drill a hole for those wires that's ample, sufficiently wide so that we can thread them through with ease, and the LED. And we'll try and avoid those two little sprung contacts there as well. So if we're going to drill a hole, let's make sure it's central to the between those. These little pin vices are an ideal addition to your tool chest if you haven't got one already. There we go. That's a hole all the way through the body shell now. If we just flip that over to check, yep, we can see daylight, so we'll be able to fit the little LED all the way through there and snake it up to our pantograph. Now let's think about supplying this little chip with the power it needs. We've already said that it's going to be located somewhere on the chassis above the PCB here, and we can move that fore or aft depending on how much wire that we actually need in terms of length to go all the way to the top of the pantograph. The two cables here obviously need to be connected to a power source, and conveniently on the chassis we have a power source which leads to our motor. We've got two terminals, M plus and M minus, and you can just see the grey and orange wires leading to the motor from this. When you think about it, soldering these two wires to these two connections makes sense because a pantograph arc flash isn't really observed unless the locomotive is moving. The only exception would be when the pantograph is raised or lowered. So when you think about it, if we apply power to the motor, the model's going to be moving, and hence we get the pantograph arc flash appear on the model. If there's no power to the motor, then the model's stationary, and obviously you're not going to want to observe a flashing pantograph arc when the model is stationary on your layout. So all I'm going to do now is fit these two wires, solder them to the two terminals there, and we'll just apply a little bit of insulation tape around this chip. Not that I expect it to short out on anything, but it's just good practice to have a little bit of insulation around exposed terminals like that on your components. Well, there you go. A little bit of insulation tape later sees the chip nicely secured in place. And I've just got to be careful that I don't get any tape here on these two little metal plates, because inside the body shell we've got two springs which make contact to power the cab lights inside with the little LEDs there. So I'm just going to thread this very small LED through the hole that we've made previously, being very careful not to destroy the contacts in the process. We'll just take it up there carefully. So there we go, the body shell is now back on. All that remains to be done is to glue the LED to the very top of the pantograph with a little bit of super glue, and there you have it. We'll have a working operational LED flash function. These wires are quite easy to pose along the pantograph because they are fairly rigid, and so when you bend them into place they will stay. But a little bit of super glue underneath soon sees them secured even better. And of course you can, if you want, later on, once this is all set and dried, you can paint the wires grey to match the colour of the pantograph and help further disguise them. But I think for now that's about in the place I want it to be. Yes, you can see the wires at the top there. Obviously, if you wanted to do this more professionally, you would probably, at a pinch, replace the entire pantograph. I'd certainly consider using a hollow piece of tubing or something along the lines of that along the bottom there and threading the wires up through that. The same for the pantograph arm really. A little bit of tubing from Albion Hobbies, for example, and you can thread the wires up. They're completely insulated, you wouldn't have any problems with that, and you can get right to the top there without any of those wires being seen. But for the purposes of review here, I think a little bit of grey paint over the top of this, and it's perfectly acceptable on a model. Okay, fingers crossed this works, the moment of truth. And it does, fantastic. So you can see we've got an arcing pantograph there, and it's completely random as well, which is what I love about this little chip, is that it makes it completely random when it's in operation. You can see there's different intervals there, there's different durations on the flash, and I think it's something that really adds to an electric model like this, where steam locomotives, you've always got the valve gear in motion, which always tends to attract the eye first and foremost when they're in motion. But an electric or a diesel, something like that, obviously it's the sound that adds to them, but having something like this just puts the little bit of an edge on the model, I think. And you can see it's a very discreet solution thanks to the size of the LED and the wires. Now on the LEDs and the wires, this is another note obviously that I should mention. The BS101, when you purchase it, will now be supplied with a pre-wired LED. I had to solder these on these, but I've just given the manufacturer some recommendations, and these are now going to be supplied pre-wired. So you won't be needing one of these to do all of your soldering. It'll be even easier to install. So there you go, whether you're a DC modeler or a DCC modeler, it's easy to install and it's very accessible and a cheap price point. I highly recommend it.